Kia ora. Welcome to Conversations with Wahine, brought to you by the Wellington branch of the National Council of Women, New Zealand.
Kia ora, everyone. How are you? I am joined here with Hayley. How are you going this week, Hayley?
Fantastic.
Yeah, nice. Good week so far?
Oh, busy, which is perfect. Perfect. So yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Same. I'm excited to have a chat as a little break this week, which is always nice. I'm really excited to speak to our guest today. So today we are joined with Dr. Jane Gregory, a clinical psychologist, misophonia researcher, and author of the book Sounds Like Misophonia: How to Stop Small Sounds from Causing Extreme Reactions. She has also created the website soundslikemisophonia.com, which provides more information about misophonia, research, and treatments. Welcome onto the show, Jane. I'm thrilled to have you here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here too, at our very drastically different time zones.
Very, very different. But you know what? You actually look like you're in the morning time over there. It looks really bright and fresh your side.
It does actually.
I've actually got a seasonal affective disorder lamp glowing on me so that I also feel like I'm in daylight, even though I haven't seen daylight for several months.
Yeah, as someone who is originally from Ireland, I know those winters all too well. Although they are honestly as rough here in Wellington because it's like an 8-month winter, so I feel your pain. For anyone that hasn't heard of the term misophonia before, could you kind of give an explanation as to what it is?
Yeah, so generally misophonia is an intense reaction to sounds that most people would find maybe a bit annoying, but wouldn't normally be too bothered by it, or that they might even not notice the sounds at all. And so typical sounds include things like chewing sounds, slurping, drinking, any kind of eating related sound, but also things like coughing and sniffing, repetitive like mouth and nose sounds, or things in the environment like tapping and keyboards and mobile phones and things like that. And so people with misophonia, it's not just that they're annoyed by these sounds, but they get a really intense reaction. Some people get almost like a fight or flight kind of reaction where they feel a feeling of rage or panic, or like they need to escape and get away from the sound. And if they don't get away from the sound, that their emotions will just continue to get stronger and stronger.
The reason I've been so looking forward to speaking with you is because I think I have this, and I stumbled across your book when I was just looking for an explanation as to why I was having such intense reactions. But you just describe it so well in that, for me, chewing and all that is fine, but bass noises, anything like that, if I hear, say, music outside or like neighbors making noise, that feeling of rage made me think I was crazy for years.
Do you remember what you looked up when you were trying to figure out what was going on?
Probably something like, am I insane for having such an extreme reaction to noise?
Because I love reading the search terms that end up that take people to my website. And it's like, why do I want to stab somebody with a fork when they eat opposite me? Why am I so unbelievably disproportionately enraged by the sound of somebody sniffing? Like, why does my dog licking himself annoy me so much? Like, just the most like fascinating search terms that drive people to me.
Because as you say, it's not just like getting irritated, it's that, for me, it's that full body, like you have that visceral reaction. You can just feel your whole body tense. It's it was like honestly game changing when I found your website and the book.
Well, and the sort of sounds that you talked about, like bass sounds, neighbor sounds, what you're describing there is like an invasion into your space from outside, which is understandable that that causes such an intense reaction, because it really is in your own private, quiet space.
Yeah, that's true.
Is it something that comes and goes throughout your life, or do you kind of grow up with it and you live the rest of your life dealing with it? Can you get over it?
It it's different for everyone. So some people say that they've sort of always been sensitive to sounds, or they notice sounds that other people don't notice, or they get more annoyed by sounds than other people. Some people, they might feel like they've had maybe a little bit more sensitive, but then something might have happened in their life where suddenly they got more bothered by these sounds, or suddenly started getting this intense reaction to sounds that they had never had before. I've also seen some people who've been through like a traumatic event where actually it kind of makes sense that your body would tune in more to sounds after something like that. So if you've been mugged, for example, then the sound of footsteps would understandably cause a really strong sort of panicky kind of reaction. And so, yeah, I think it's different for different people. Across like a general population study, we found that actually the severity of misophonia tends to go down as people get older. But there are also lots of people who say it's gotten worse as they've gotten older, or they've gotten more frustrated by it. But probably the people who are still interested in misophonia as they get older are more likely to be the people who are still bothered by it, whereas the ones who get better over time are less likely to take part in research because it's not such a problem for them anymore. So it's hard to judge like exactly what the pattern is over the lifespan. I know that for me personally, like I've done lots of everything that I write about in the book, I've tried on myself. So I've done lots and lots of different things to try and improve the situation for myself. But also one of the biggest factors for me is just having more control as I get older over my environment, and being able to not take jobs where I have to sit in an open plan office, and being able to live in a house that doesn't have neighbors stomping upstairs like I had to when I was living in a flat in London. I mean, I can't do much about my children and the noise that they make, but they're also getting a little bit older and at least changing in the nature of how noisy and what kind of noises they make.
No, that's very interesting. I did wonder, do you have many people that come to you with issues with high-pitched noises? Like me in particular, I can hear high-pitched noises that people my age aren't even supposed to hear. And I don't get angry, but I feel so nauseous that I just want to be sick. I feel like I need to be sick as soon as it happens. My brother used to tease me with it when we were teenagers.
Oh, wow. So you've
Yeah.
basically got a dog's hearing. That's what you're saying. That
Uh,
dogs can hear those sort of high pitched
Apparently,
sounds.
I don't know if it's scientific, but you might have heard
Mm,
about these pitches that you can hear at a certain age and how adults apparently can't
yep.
hear it. I
Yeah.
found out that this existed for me when we were starting to go through the pitches, and I was hearing ones I wasn't supposed to hear. And then some of them I didn't even fully hear. I just felt intense nausea until it turned out that my brother was actually playing it. And
Oh my
as soon
goodness.
as he
Wow. So your
stopped,
body
nausea
was
would stop.
reacting.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
even when I couldn't fully pick it up in my head, I just felt like I needed to be sick, and we kind of
Yeah.
slowly over time figured out that like that's exactly what it was. I don't know if
Oh,
it's
that's
kind of related though.
fascinating. Yeah, so there's two different things that I want to say there. So one, the first thing is I think it's really interesting to hear that your body was reacting even though you weren't perceiving the sound, so you weren't registering it. And that's really common in people who live in really noisy environments, or under a flight path, or next to a freeway or something like that. Often they
Oh.
say, I don't notice it anymore, but when you strap things like measurement things to their body is actually under stress when those sounds are there. It's just that their brain is telling them it's not there because there's no reason to pay attention to it anymore. But the body is still processing those sounds and ignoring those sounds, which causes stress on the body. So living in a noisy environment, even if you think you don't hear those noises, still creates stress on the body. And that sounds like exactly what you're describing there. Your brain knows that you don't need to hear it. It's treating it like a repetitive sound that you kind of just get used to, but your your body is still processing it, and processing it as something that isn't supposed to be there. So that's the first part that I found really interesting about that. The second part, in where it relates to misophonia, is that when they've done tests, like audiology testing on people with and without misophonia, generally there seems to be no difference in actual audiometry testing, I think they call it. So there's no distinct differences in terms of how you hear sounds, how your ears work, that kind of thing. Some people with misophonia have exceptional hearing, others just have average hearing, and of course some people have hearing loss, but there's no noticeable differences. So they don't think it's about how the ear is functioning, that it's actually happening at a deeper level in the brain in terms of how your brain perceives those sounds and what that sound means to you and what your brain and body are telling you that sound means. So something like responding to a high-pitched sound would fall into a category of like an audiological phenomenon, as opposed to misophonia, which can't quite be classified yet because we don't really understand exactly what the mechanisms are that make it such a problem for people.
Wow, that's fascinating. Going back to misophonia a little bit, I know that as many as about 1 in 5 people in at least the UK and the US, I'm not so sure about New Zealand where we are, they either may have it, however, many likely have subclinical misophonia. Can you explain the difference between these?
That's right. So the UK study, so that was a study that I actually worked on, where we took a representative sample of the UK. So it was roughly equivalent to the UK population in terms of age, gender, ethnicity. And we surveyed these hundreds of people using this questionnaire that we developed to measure misophonia. But when we did that study, it hadn't been kind of agreed what the definition of misophonia was. So we based it on interviews with people where we assessed from a clinical, like it was psychologists who did the interviews, we assessed that it was a problem for that person, but we didn't have any sort of agreed definition of how much of a problem it needed to be considered misophonia. So when we used those interviews to then work out what the cutoff on that questionnaire would be, which then gave us the prevalence, that ended up including what we call subclinical misophonia, which is people who get these reactions to sounds. If they had to stay in the presence of those sounds, it would drive them mad and they'd probably have to leave or block their ears or do something, or would be really distressed and suffer through it. But on a day-to-day basis, they don't necessarily get affected or distressed, or it doesn't necessarily affect their mental health or stop them from doing most of the things that they want to be able to do. Whereas now in some work was done with a group of professionals where they sort of came to an agreement that it should be considered a disorder. And if we were going to define something as a disorder, we'd usually say that it would need to have a significant impact in terms of the level of distress it causes and the level of impairment. And so we haven't done a study yet that is doing interviews that captures that's much, much smaller proportion of people, which we think is somewhere between like maybe 1 and 5%, nowhere near as many as sort of 18%, which we found in the other study, or 17% what they found in the US study. So there's a bit of a question about whether it should be called a disorder, because there are a lot of people who can relate to this phenomenon and say, yep, I get enraged when I hear these sounds. I can't stay in the room if I hear them, but they wouldn't consider themselves to have a disorder. And I now would no longer consider myself to have a disorder. I don't think it affects me enough on a day-to-day basis to say I would never turn up to my GP and say I've got this disorder, but I very much identify with the term misophonia. And but then for people who do have it at a disorder level, it feels sort of maybe a little bit undermining to their suffering for other people to be using the same term to describe something that they're really suffering from on a day-to-day basis. So it's a really complicated thing. And I think that there's sort of misophonia, the phenomenon, and misophonia, the disorder, and we should be treating the disorder with the respect it deserves and be offering treatment and support for those people, but also for all the other people, offering information and tips and ideas for how to help that, because it's also that will affect them, maybe not on a day-to-day basis, but it will affect them over their lives.
Oh, that's really interesting. I guess it's a little bit like OCD. So there's people like me who are diagnosed and actually do struggle with the disorder. And then so many people who just say, oh, this is my OCD. I like it clean. It doesn't bother me. I laugh about it, but I can understand how it kind of takes away the seriousness of the actual disorder and can sometimes make it a little bit harder to get the treatment that you need. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really great comparison, and especially because that's become such a thing to say. Like, and it's great that OCD got more awareness as a result of people learning more about it. But then what happened as a result of that was people saying, "I'm so OCD." And it's like, well, no, you're not. Like, the D part is very, very important. So you might be very OC, but to have a disorder, you have to have the distress and impairment part. Otherwise, it's not a disorder. So, yeah, and I know that a lot of people with OCD like, similarly feel sort of undermined by that or dismissed because of that. So there can be a problem with relating too much to something when you don't really understand it.
Yeah, that's true. How many people do you find come to you with issues with snoring? Is that quite a popular one?
Yeah, that's a very popular one,
Oh, yeah.
and largely because the impact of it is so huge, and the control over it is so limited. And
Yeah.
those two things together are like a perfect storm for misophonia because you have no control over it. The other really hard part about it is that the other person has no control over it either. So with eating, like if you're in a sort of kind reciprocal relationship, sometimes you can say, please, can you just eat with your mouth closed? I can't handle it. But you can't tell somebody to not snore because they can't help it either. And so it just creates all of these variables that contribute to making that worse. And of course, the worse your sleep is, the harder it is to deal with your emotions. And so then the reaction just gets more and more intense. And personally, I just sleep in a different room now. That has saved my marriage, not having to listen to somebody else, not even just snoring, like just loud breathing at night is too much for me. I just need peace and quiet. And I appreciate that I'm speaking from a place of extreme privilege that I have the space to be able to sleep in a separate bedroom. But it was exhausting just being awake for a lot of the time or not fully going into deep sleep because my brain was just waiting for the snoring to start. It also caused a lot of
Yeah.
resentment. Like if my husband falls asleep on the sofa while we're watching TV or something, it's just like how dare you be sleeping right now? Like we're doing this thing together and you're being so vocal about how asleep you are right now.
I think what you said there is really interesting about waiting for the noise, because that I feel like that's a real trap you can fall into, in that you're not hearing the noise, but your body's like on edge, just waiting. It almost feels like you're torturing yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that especially applies to situations similar to what you've described, where the noise is coming from neighbors, from outside the house, where it could just happen at any time. You can't control it and you can't predict it
Yeah.
either. And so part of you is just always waiting for it. And that um, takes up a lot of energy to be anticipating something that you don't want to hear. And so I find that for the people who come for treatment, if they've got that part of it where in between sounds, it's causing a problem because they're waiting or anticipating sounds, or after the sound stops, they keep listening out, or they're replaying it in their mind, or taking a long time to wind down, or like replaying situations like, oh, I can't believe that person would, how dare they do that, and ruminating over the situation, they're going to be the ones that are probably the most severely affected by misophonia because it's taken over their whole life. It's not just a problem when sounds are present, it's a problem in between sounds as well. And so that would usually be the first place we would work on in therapy, is to try and reclaim that time between sounds so that the problem of misophonia doesn't extend beyond just the moments when the sounds are there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. When I had a partner who did used to snore, thankfully the one I have now is perfect. I used to have to fall asleep with headphones in my ear and just thunder and rain sounds playing every single night. It was the only way that
Yeah.
I could chill out and not just have a panic attack about it. It was insane.
Yeah, and it's great that you found a solution. Like some people that I think having, if you don't mind that kind of white noise or nature sounds or something, then at least you can play something that is louder than the sound you're trying to ignore. But a lot of people also can't sleep with other sounds and just need silence. And it's like you put the earplugs in and it's like, why is this not silent? Why can I still hear things? And sometimes that makes you more angry. And that's also something that we work on a bit in therapy, is the thing that you're doing to try and not hear the sound. Is it actually working? And sometimes is it making it worse? Like if you get more angry because you can still hear it, even though you're trying to stop it, sometimes that can make you more angry than if you just accept the presence of the sound and deal with it. Not always, sometimes that's a disaster as well. But yeah, that idea of I shouldn't be able to hear it anymore and I still can compound the emotions that you're already experiencing.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you bring the mental aspect into it, because I remember how any human snoring, I can't handle it. I can't. Oh, a dog snoring, however, puts me to sleep. It's so calming and
Adorable.
peaceful and
Yeah.
sweet.
Oh yeah, when my cat just nibbles daintily on her food, it's like oh, that's the cutest thing I've ever seen or heard. If I thought that was my husband making the exact same noise, I would be having a very different emotional reaction.
I wonder
And
if
that
it's
there's
something.
been some research about that as well, like where they've
Oh,
actually played this exact same audio but manipulated what the person sees, what it looks like is creating the sound, and the reaction is really different. And when I do
Oh.
like training and talks and stuff, I've got a video where I show a picture of celery, and you can see the video behind it, and it looks like an arm, and I'm like, oh, this is a person eating celery. I want you to rate how intense you find the sound. And then I like reveal behind this piece of celery is actually a panda eating bamboo. And so it's the exact same audio, but it's this cute little panda, like just like pulling apart this bamboo and munching away, and is obviously delighted with its meal. And nearly everyone says immediately the intensity of the reaction completely drops because they've got more information now about what's going on. So there's definitely something about the context of the sound, and also like the agency of the person or thing making the
Yeah.
sound. Like if you think that they're making a deliberate choice to be rude and disgusting, you're going to have a much stronger reaction than if you believe that they just can't help it, or that that's just the nature of being a panda, for example.
That's so interesting. It reminds me of those little videos that you get of pugs eating vegetables, and it's ASMR videos that people actually listen to find it calming. But I mean, I'm sure there's some of people eating as well. But I wonder if the difference has something to do with what we are allowing into our space, like what you're talking about earlier. I think it's much easier for animal lovers to allow animals into our space in ways that we just wouldn't humans that we may actually really love.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a really important factor. And that's a really important part of making changes in misophonia as well, is changing that idea of control and making space. So if you're doing anything, like, because the idea is that your brain has sort of associated these sounds with a sense of harm or danger in some way, and what we want to do is try and teach the brain that these sounds are no more harmful than any other annoying sound. And if you have that experience where the exact same audio from a panda creates a different reaction from if you thought it was a person, then we know that the brain is doing something with perception there. And so we can use that to try and create a new association with sounds and try and teach the brain that this is not a harmful thing. Even if it's disgusting, even if it's annoying, it's no more harmful than any other disgusting or annoying sound. So you can actually use videos, and again, if you're in control of it, then if you're opting into it and it's not happening to you, then already you've got a new experience with that sound, because it's not something that's happening to you, it's something that you're opting into.
Oh, voluntary exposure therapy.
Yeah, I mean,
A little bit.
it's interesting because that exposure therapy is a bit of a dirty word in misophonia, because often people have gone for therapy and the therapist has well intended but mistakenly tried to get them to just get used to the sound, and actually that doesn't work. And for most people, what happens instead is the opposite. So instead of desensitizing, so like as the more you listen to it, you would expect like the emotions to come down, which happens a lot in anxiety. It does actually come down once your body learns that you're safe. But when anger and disgust and shame are part of the emotional reaction, those things do not desensitize in the same way as anxiety, because you don't discover straight away that it's not dangerous. If you think something's dangerous and you discover immediately that it's not, you learn quite quickly, the anxiety comes down. But if you're perceiving something to be a violation and so you're feeling angry, or if something could be a contaminant and you feel disgusted, or you're feeling bad about yourself and feeling ashamed, you don't get any immediate feedback that those things aren't true. So the emotion doesn't come down. And in fact, it can get worse. It can escalate and sensitize instead of desensitize. So lots of people have been subjected to that, either from therapists or from parents or partners or siblings saying, I'll just get used to it, and it doesn't work. But if you do it in a way where the person with misophonia is the one in control of it, and the only goal is to have a new experience with the sound, and it's just short-lived, and they just try it out, and if it doesn't work and doesn't help in any way, they don't keep doing it, then that can create those new associations in the brain. But yeah, we wouldn't ask them to just sort of sit there and hope that it gets better, because generally it doesn't.
That's the really hard thing with something like this, is because there just isn't a lot of research yet around it. And I definitely find people aren't familiar with it. So I guess that's where you run the risk of, like that a therapist suggesting treatments that just aren't suitable.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm aware that I've made some of those mistakes as well, just based on assumptions that I made because things look similar to other things that I know how to help with. So with OCD, for example, we know that if you don't do the compulsion, over time, your brain learns that it's not dangerous, that you don't need to do it, and that the thing you predict will happen, you get more value from living your life than you do from like preventing these highly unlikely dangers. And so the instinct with misophonia is, oh, well, avoiding the sound or blocking the sound, that might be making it worse over time, in the same way that avoidance and anxiety makes it worse over time. And so the instinct would be, okay, well, let's do the opposite. Let's like face the sound. Let's do the thing. And actually it's not the same. Like the mechanisms are different. And actually a lot of the coping strategies that people use aren't the same as anxiety disorders or OCD, because actually those strategies help them to live their life. Whereas in a lot of those other disorders, those strategies limit them from living their life. So, somebody who spends an hour doing compulsions, that's an hour that they're not living their life. But if somebody puts earplugs in and therefore they can get their work done, that's an hour of their life lived as a result of that behavior choice. And so it's so individual. You sort of have to work out with the individual person. Let's just test. Let's A, make sure it is doing the thing that it's meant to be doing. And B, let's just check if there are any unintended consequences, especially in relation to other people. So if you're doing something that feels like it helps, like, for example, glaring at somebody who's eating too loudly, it's like, well, that will work because that will stop. They'll realize what they're doing and they'll stop doing it. But if the other person has no idea why you're glaring at them, and then they just glare back at you, and then it creates a tension that you are trying to shut down, that's an unintended consequence. Or if you've got somebody in the family with misophonia and somebody in the family with ADHD, and the person with ADHD needs to fidget to get their energy out, and that's part of their personal needs, but the person with misophonia needs things to be still and quiet, and that's part of their personal needs, you've then got a competition between needs, and you have to work out a solution together how to manage both of those needs. And there might not be a solution that meets everybody's needs all the time.
So interesting. Just, managing it with multiple different people in a house. It can be really difficult. I think, luckily I have a partner who's really supportive, and I'm that person who has my white noise machine blasting at night and he just rolls with it. But you do really have to learn to adapt and support one another. For you, Jane, when do you think misophonia first kind of appeared for you? Like, were you always sensitive to sound, or was it something that emerged later?
The earliest I can remember is about 8 years old. And one of the reasons I remember is because I remember I was on my own in my bedroom, and I didn't get my own room until I was probably 7 or 8. And there were these pigeons outside my window, and this was the space. I had 3 siblings. It was a loud house full of people. I would go to my room to escape the noise, and then there were these pigeons outside my window that just kept making that repetitive noise at me through the window, and it honestly felt like they were tormenting me, like it was a deliberate thing to stop me from relaxing, to stop me from reading, to stop me from sleeping, or to wake me up in the morning, and it felt like torture. But of course, no one else understood that. So when I tried to explain to my parents that the pigeons are torturing me, it didn't
Yeah.
make sense to anyone. So then what was already a confusing reaction became even more confusing because nobody could understand what I was trying to explain. And then it sort of progressed to eating sounds, and then at school it was like pens clicking and people chewing gum, and anything that the clocks ticking actually was a really big one as well. Anything that took me out of what I would rather be doing became really, really frustrating. So I used to have to like hide. This was like in the 90s. So I had like the old school Walkman like whirring in my pocket of my school uniform, and I'd like hid it underneath my jumper and like put it underneath my hair and managed to listen to music quietly. And I'm fairly sure I was the only person in that school who was listening to music because I wanted to learn, whereas everyone else was doing it to like not have to listen to the teacher. I'm like, no, I can't hear the teacher if I'm having to listen to all these other sounds. I was like, my brain just wouldn't switch them off.
Did you
Yeah,
get
I was.
told off for it?
They never caught me. I mean, I was a massive nerd and very well behaved, and so they would never have expected. And I was always like doing my work, so it wasn't like I was like looking out the window and they're like, "Why isn't she doing her work?" I was concentrating, and so yeah, I never got caught. I'm sure other people must have been furious that I got away with listening to music and they were being told off for it.
Yeah, I was that kid
that-
who would always take the batteries out of a clock if it ticked loudly, and it used to
Oh my
drive my
goodness.
family insane. I'm like,
Yeah.
it's like nails on a chalkboard. I don't know how you can live
Yeah.
like this.
Oh my goodness. Yep. So many clocks. I've taken batteries out. I've like wrapped them in clothes. If I've stayed at a friend's house once, I like wrapped her alarm clock in clothes and then hid it in her drawer. Every NHS office that I've ever worked in the health service here, they have these really loud white clocks, and they're in every single NHS hospital and office. And I mean, working as a therapist, you're working in a room where silence is part of the process, and you're often doing like meditation techniques and things like that. And I could just hear this tick, tick, tick. And so everyone always knew which office I was in because I would leave the clock outside the door and just left a trail behind me with clocks
Trail
that
of
had their
clocks.
batteries removed or taken out of the room. Yeah. But I started replacing all of the clocks at any office that I worked in. I would buy a really nice silent sweep clock, which still looks like an analog clock, but has a silent mechanism. So I just started to slowly replace all of the clocks in the rooms that I had to work in.
That makes me think of my alarms to wake me up in the morning. I got a Fitbit that just has a vibrate alarm, so I actually don't need to hear anything, and just the morning is so much more peaceful.
Nice.
So much less
Yeah.
anxiety inducing now because my hand just vibrates when I need to wake up.
Yeah, it's just like, hey, wake up, it's time.
So gentle.
Yeah, that sounds lovely. Yeah, I like those ones that saw things that are just a light, and they just like turn the light on, and your room slowly becomes like daytime.
What a lovely start to a day.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I couldn't get it to go bright enough that it would actually wake me up though. Like I couldn't rely on it to wake me up. I do have a very gentle music for my alarm sound now. That people who wake up to an in alarm because of the alarm, I just can't handle that.
Yeah, my brother, he used to wake up to one, and it was like an emergency alarm in a warehouse factory, just like "Grr,"
Oh my
every single
goodness.
morning. I had no idea how he didn't just have a heart attack waking up to that.
Yeah, that would terrify me every day. Oh my goodness. How does anyone wake up to that? I guess
Oh,
it's effective. It serves its purpose, but I don't want to wake up feeling that stressed.
yeah, I feel like there's better ways to serve that purpose.
I've now got a very reliable cat that jumps on my bed every morning at about 6:45, 15 minutes before I need to be up, and just like starts making noise and wriggling around until I wake up and start patting her, and then she lies there, and then we've got about 15 minutes just to chill together before I actually have to wake up. Decided that's the
Oh,
ultimate alarm.
that's so good. My body clock is so good now. I don't normally need an alarm. And probably because I used to raise little wild birds and I was raising a little blackbird at one point. And 6 o'clock every morning on the dot, I would hear just a little thump on my bed, and this bird would jump out of its box and hop up and then just start pecking my eyes and my ears until I woke up. I had to start wearing goggles and headphones just to sleep every night, but I woke up at 6 o'clock. I started waking up just 1 to 2 minutes before just so I could prevent it happening every single day. And
Yeah.
I don't think it's, I think the habit's still
That's
there like
wow.
15 years
Yeah, I
later.
mean, if you had to choose between the warehouse alarm or having your eyeballs pecked out, which would you choose?
I'm with the bird.
Moving on from that anyway, what do you think the biggest misconception is around people who have misophonia?
That's a great question. I think it depends which angle you're looking at it from. So I think in the general population, people who hear about somebody with misophonia, I think the biggest misconception is that they can fix it, that they can just ignore it. And like that's the most common thing that people say has been said to them is like, just ignore it. Like because somebody else can ignore a sound, they assume that you can ignore the sound. Within the misophonia community, I think it's really tough at the moment because there's a bit of a divide in whether we can do anything to help misophonia or whether it's sort of fixed and stuck. And so I think that's one misconception is that there's nothing that we can do about it. And I don't think that there's a cure for it. And I do believe that there are elements of it that are fixed. It's just our brain just processes sounds in different ways. But I do think that there are multiple layers to misophonia, and a lot of those layers can change. And by um, experiencing things in a different way, by thinking about things in a different way, by doing things differently, by prioritizing things differently, or talking to people about things differently, it can actually change your overall experience of misophonia. Even if that sort of fundamental part of the brain doesn't change, the intensity of your reactions will change as you start to work on those layers that are sort of form part of the overall experience. I think part of the problem is that there's a lot that we don't know about it, or there are a lot of unanswered questions. And so actually the information that we have about misophonia is really rapidly changing. So even somebody who has worked with misophonia or had misophonia, like they might change their conception of it as we go. So for example, there was this one really important, well, several now really important research studies that showed that there were differences in the brain between people with and without misophonia, and that difference existed only in the context of misophonia type sounds and not in the context of just generally annoying sounds. So it was this really important evidence that showed in brain scans that the brains were functioning different in people with misophonia. But one of the misconceptions that came from that is that means that this is like a neurological problem. That means it's fixed. That means we can't do anything about it. There's something different in our brains and therefore we can't change it. But actually what that study showed was that there are differences in the brain for people with misophonia, but that could be because they have misophonia. And so their brains, the sort of connections in the brain strengthened in a certain direction because of the way they reacted to sounds. It doesn't necessarily mean that the differences in the brain caused the misophonia. And we also know that the way our neural pathways in the brain are connected are actually quite flexible. And when we experience things in a different way, it actually changes our connections in the brain. And we see that in depression, in post-traumatic stress disorder, in OCD, like when they do brain scans before and after treatment for those disorders, they observe differences in the brain as a result of the changes that you've made from therapy. So when you look at a brain study, people think, oh, that is fixed, that's why I am the way that I am. But actually it's a representation of how you are now. And if things change for you, then those brain patterns will change as well.
Oh, it's fascinating. I would love to see brain scans adopted just within general society. I think it's a lot harder to get brain scans than we would like at the moment. It would be so cool if just the general population were able to get one more regularly, almost like part of a
Yeah.
doctor checkup. Oh, it'd be fascinating.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And like they're also very expensive, so I can understand why we don't do it
Yeah.
routinely. But also they're really easy to misinterpret. Like most things can't actually be diagnosed by a brain scan, because a lot of things have really similar patterns of behavior and emotions, but show up really differently depending on the individual. So a brain scan of somebody with OCD could look really similar to a brain scan with someone with misophonia, because both are related to anticipating things that you think are going to be harmful. They're both related to interpreting internal sensations in your body as a sign of harm or danger. So there's a lot of processes that are happening that will be reflected in your brain scans. But just looking at the brain scan, there's no way you could say, oh, that person has OCD and that person has misophonia, because they might look exactly the same. It's really interesting. But I think that where it would be really helpful is to be able to monitor things over time and to see, especially the result of doing something different, to see that actually changes the way your brain functions. I think that would be amazing. And I would love for there to be studies that do that.
Yeah, that would be so interesting. Like a longitudinal study on treatments and incorporating brain scans would be fascinating to see.
Yeah,
You said
absolutely.
something there at the start of that answer, which was around, telling people often tell you to ignore it, the sounds that are annoying. That really resonated with me. And in your book, you also had a really powerful statement, which was, I spent most of my life thinking I was uptight and intolerant, when in reality you had misophonia. And I just think that is a big part of it, especially if you're in public, that fear of inconveniencing people around you. I'm a real people pleaser, so that's something where, it's almost like I'm being affected, but you don't want to bother other people with it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that that's a really common experience in misophonia. And often one of the reasons misophonia is so hard is because it's like this contradiction in your personality, that you're this really nice, caring person who really cares about other people, and you're feeling really angry and want to attack other people because of the sounds that they're making. And it's such a stark contrast in terms of how you understand yourself. It's like you have to adopt this other part of your identity that is in direct contradiction to everything else that you know about yourself. And as a kid, when that happens, it's really instinctive to believe that therefore there's something wrong with you, that you misunderstood the other parts of you and this is the real you. And then you spend all your time trying to protect other people from the real you, because you think deep down, I'm this angry, violent person and I'm just lucky that it hasn't come out yet. And actually, you're a kind, caring, gentle person who can't regulate their emotions in the presence of these specific sounds. And actually, that's the only context where your emotions get on top of you. And that doesn't change the base reality, which is that you're still this kind, caring person. But it's really hard to reconcile those two pieces of information, especially as a kid. And often, not just parents, like other people around you don't necessarily help with that, because they don't understand it either. And especially for like people my age, where misophonia was definitely not known about when I was a kid. And so there's no framework to understand it. There's no better explanation for it than you're being too sensitive, you're being dramatic, you're being controlling of other people. And that's the exact opposite of what I wanted to be. I didn't want, I say as what you were saying, Ash, is like I didn't want to bother other people. And that was actually a really important part of my identity. So the fact that I needed other people to do things so that I could be okay was a real challenge for me, and I would rather leave the situation and suffer myself than impose that on other people.
Yeah, that resonates massively with me. And I think, when something like that presents in a child, as you say, it's often kids can be very easily dismissed. You're just being dramatic, ignore it, get over it. And then of course you internalize all of that, and it can exasperate the problem.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that a lot of kids go through this process where initially they assume that everyone here sounds the same way, and therefore, why would anyone do that? So therefore, if someone is doing it, they must be doing it deliberately to harm you or annoy you or upset you. And then you go so it starts as this like real externalizing process, like, this is you doing this to me because you must know what this is doing to me. And then you realize that not everyone here sounds in the same way, that no one else is reacting the way that you are. And so you have to come up with a new explanation, and then that becomes that more internal self-blame kind of explanation, especially if you've got other people telling you the same story, that you're too sensitive or too dramatic or intolerant. And what we find with misophonia, so one of the things that came out of the questionnaire that we developed was these sort of 5 aspects of misophonia emerged from this data that we collected on lots of different people with misophonia. And 2 of those aspects were what we call internalizing and externalizing. So this feeling that it is both the blame, like you can put the blame on other people, that they should just behave better, and that's why I react the way that I do. And this is on me. This is my fault. There's something wrong with me deep down that I'm reacting this way. And that people can believe both of those things at the same time. And that then creates even more conflict and more stress, because it both feels like you are being deliberately harmed by somebody else, and like there's something wrong with you, or you're this angry person deep inside or something.
It seems that misophonia may be linked with past trauma. For example, you do speak a lot about your inner miso child. Can you speak a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And if we think of trauma, so it's a bit of a buzzword. Like, I see it all the time in social media at the moment. This idea of things being a trauma reaction. And I think I should probably make a distinction between trauma that is the sort of thing that would cause something like post-traumatic stress disorder, which is usually a life-threatening event that you either experience or witness or hear about, where it's sort of a disorder of memory. So your brain processes that memory as if it's still happening. And so you continue to re-experience it whenever you're reminded of that trauma. And so that's what we sort of call big T trauma. And then there's small T trauma, which are moments where at the time it was happening, your core emotional needs weren't being met, and they weren't met immediately after either. Like, sometimes you can go through an experience where your needs aren't met, but then you kind of recover from that experience because your sense of how the world works is restored afterwards, and it all gets nicely processed and consolidated. But if you don't get that experience afterwards, then these moments can kind of get stuck in time. And so when I talk about the inner miso child, that's people who have been through experiences that might shape the way they react to sounds now. And so I use a really simple example when I do training on this, is if you're a kid who is maybe a little bit sensitive to noise, finds it hard to ignore sounds. That's just how your brain works. And then one day you come home from school, you've had a really rough day. Maybe someone's done or said something really horrible that day, and all you need to recover from that is silence. And you just need to be able to get away from the noise, go somewhere quiet. And instead, what you're forced to do is sit at the dinner table, and it's really noisy, and your brother's chewing in your ear. And so you're not getting that need met, because actually what you needed was a quiet space to recover. And so you get really angry because actually your need in that moment isn't being met. And then because you get angry, you might snap at your brother, and then your mum tells you off. And so now the sound of your brother, your brain has associated that with feeling angry, with feeling like your needs won't be met, and with the feeling of being told off and getting upset. And so then what was previously a mildly unpleasant sound becomes connected in your brain with a feeling of anger and upset and being told off, or embarrassment or humiliation. And so then when you hear that sound again the next time, some of those feelings will come back to the surface. And if you don't have any way of processing those feelings when they come back to the surface, or someone to help you look after those feelings, you won't know what to do with them. And so then they'll feel out of control. And so then that sound becomes associated with anger, being humiliated, upset, and feeling out of control. Like your emotions are crazy and unpredictable and don't make sense to anyone. And so then that gets kind of stuck in time and you don't have a better explanation for it. And as you get older, that's now sort of processed in your brain as that sound equals those things. And so you get that same emotional reaction even as an adult, even though you now maybe even understand, oh, it's misophonia, that's why I react that way. That part of your brain that made those connections way back when you're a child is stuck in time. And so the importance of recognizing that sort of inner meso child is actually sort of going back in time and comforting that child and meeting the needs that weren't met at the time. And so it's actually like sort of bringing that memory back to the surface and comforting that part of yourself that feels angry, that feels scared, feels out of control, feels told off, and just saying like, you're okay. Like you're just having a bad day. Your brother's being mean because that's what brothers do sometimes. Your mum doesn't understand why you're doing what you're doing. So that's why she's upset and everything's too noisy. And that's why you're reacting the way you're reacting. And that's what you needed in the moment, but that wasn't available at the time. But you can actually reconnect with that moment and update that moment in your memory, which is what our memories are supposed to do. When we recall an event, we update it based on what we've learned since then, how we feel about the world now. And so this would be really normal. For example, if you had an experience of bullying as a kid, at the time, it's going to feel humiliating. It's going to feel scary. The next day, the fear might have gone, but when you remember it, you feel embarrassed because you're now sort of processing it from the perspective of, oh, everyone saw, and now everyone thinks I'm weak, or whatever that sort of new interpretation might be. When you remember it as an adult, you apply the perspective of what you've learned since then. So you might actually feel sorry for yourself as a kid. You might even feel sorry for the bully because you now understand that bullies are often bullies because they've got tough stuff happening for them as well. So that memory, it's not fixed based on what happened at the time. It morphs based on what you've experienced since then, how you understand how things work since then. And we can deliberately bring on that process by revisiting memories and deliberately sort of adding in that information that we wish we'd known at the time that would have made that experience different for us at the time. Sorry, I've just talked for so long about that. I find it so fascinating. So I just keep going.
Yeah, because it
is.
sounds similar to a lot of other mental health disorders. I know in anxiety, that's often a really big thing, is, you know, looking at that inner child, and, you know, often there is some sort of past trauma. So it is, you know, quite a similar approach to other things. It's just, I think as an adult can feel funny having that conversation with your inner child. You know, I've had to do that in therapy, and it is challenging. But also it can be a bit overwhelming at the start, because initially you might just not even know what that initial past trauma is that sparked it. There's a lot to unpack in your memories.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's why if we're doing that as part of the process with misophonia, we don't just go looking for any old memory. We use a current experience where your emotions feel out of control and actually bring that to the surface, and then let your mind float back and think about, okay, what does this remind me of? Do any memories come to the surface? And if nothing comes to the surface, you don't push it any further than that. But if something does, then there's a good chance that you've got just this memory that's a little bit stuck in time, that is fueling your current reactions and needs a little bit of updating and processing so that you don't get such an intense reaction in the moment.
I know in your book you had you kind of worked through the book, and you had 5 different people tell their real stories, and a lot of that, especially at the start, was around them linking it back to past memories or their earliest memory of being really negatively affected by noise. And I thought that was a really powerful example of almost showing in real life how you can apply treatments and just reflect on what misophonia is in different people and how it can present. When you started doing the book, was that something you planned from the get-go, I want to have real people, or was it something that evolved, and how did you get those people? Yeah, just how did that work?
Yeah, that was a very deliberate thing. And that's one of the things that I'm very conscious of having misophonia myself and working with misophonia, is that I don't want to impose my own experiences on anyone else's experience. And so I wanted to make sure that the book was about more than just my experience. And I wasn't suggesting that whatever I went through should be what you went through, and whatever helps me should help you. So I definitely wanted to have that experience with other people. And what I also wanted was for their experience of change to come from the materials in the book and not come from any kind of therapeutic relationship with me, so that I could show that the book itself and the ideas in the book can be helpful, and can be helpful in different ways for different people. And it's not actually therapy. So I didn't speak to any of the volunteers until the very end of the book. With the final chapter where we've got information about how they reflected on their experience of the book, I was part of those interviews. But my contributing author, Adil, that was what he contributed to the book, was he did all of those interviews to begin with and sent people the materials, and then got their quotes and feedback on the materials, so that their experience with the book was as if they were reading the book. They weren't reporting on therapy with misophonia. They were only reporting on using the self-help. And you can see that some people, like one person stopped after part 2, they just didn't keep going, but they came back to do the final interview, and we talked about that. And like, that was also fine, because that is a very real experience that other people will likely have with this book, is that there are some parts that they won't connect with. Some people will stop reading it and just go, oh, that's not for me. Some people might come back a year later and go, oh, maybe I'll have a look at a different chapter. And the idea is that you move around the book. You don't just read it from start to finish. You finish a bit and then you go, okay, there's some little prompt questions. And it's like, where would that take me to based on how I feel right now, what I think is most important, what my goals are, which parts of this chapter most connected with me. And then it sort of sends you off in the direction of other chapters. The volunteers didn't get that luxury, because they were getting it as it was being written. So they got it in whatever order I wrote it, which was not coherent. So sometimes they would get an update. It was like, oh, this chapter's a little bit better now, if you'd like to try again. So their experience was a bit more haphazard. But also, again, that reflects like that might be what people do with the book. They might just open it up and see, oh, what's on this page, and see whether it applies to them or not.
Yeah, because you very much, and you present that up front. If anyone hasn't seen it, this is the book. I have it beside me with lots of sticky notes. But you present it is a workbook. It's not a book you just sit and read. It's something you physically work through. Yeah, which was interesting, because I think a lot of the time with other books around mental health disorders, it can be, one perspective, and it's just, here's all the research and the problems, and, thank you for listening. Whereas this is a very practical tool more than just a book, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there will be people who will just choose to read it. And sometimes just having the information is enough to prompt change. But actually, most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, you have to actively try things differently and get a bit of guidance and direction to try things differently. And I read loads and loads of self-help books when I was writing this, because I wanted to sort of understand what I thought would work and wouldn't work. And the ones that I found the most frustrating were the ones that had loads of information, were really well researched, but like the last chapter was the strategies. And so you had to read everything else before you got to the strategies. And I'm like, no, I want right from the start, I want there to be things that you can do, things that you can reflect on, and ideas to sort of stimulate your thinking, and things that you can try differently. And so that was my goal, was to make the book that on any given page, there would be more pages that have something you can try differently than there is pages that just have information on it.
Nice.
Well, that's fantastic. If people have been affected by anything brought up in this episode, where can they go for more information and support?
Well, that is a tricky question, because there is not a lot of information and support out there. It's really hard to find help. Like if what you need is somebody to help and support you, I sympathize, because there is just not much out there in terms of people who understand it and can actively help you. There's lots of information. So I've got some on my website, although it's a little out of date now. There's So Quiet is a brilliant charity that has lots of information about misophonia. They have lots of resources. They'll send stuff for free around the world for like they've got these little cards that you can hand to someone if you're too stressed out or you don't want to say anything. It's a card that says, I have misophonia. This noise that you're making is causing me stress. If it's possible, you're not doing anything wrong, but if it's possible, can you please not make that sound? And they'll send that around the world. So Quiet charity is absolutely amazing. And yeah, that's probably the over and above my own website. That is probably the place that I would send people for the most information and resources. My website does have some information. I hope people will find the book incredibly helpful. But also, I think it's really helpful to test the waters with people because not everyone will understand. And I include health professionals in that you might mention it to your doctor. And if your doctor immediately says, oh, it's just part of your anxiety, or it's just this, or it's just that, it's like, oh, that's not a health professional that is wanting to understand this. But if you've got someone who's curious, someone, either a health professional or just someone in your life, a loved one or a friend, if they're curious about it, then take another step and give them a bit more information and invite them to be part of the conversation. And I think that that's the best that you will get, is if you tread gently, because I do appreciate that lots of people aren't respectful, and especially things like people have had experiences in workplaces, for example, where they'll tell somebody that they have misophonia and then people will deliberately make the sounds, like intentionally trying to cause them to be upset. So I don't think it's one of those things, oh, you have to be open and tell people about it. But I do think it's worth just gently testing the waters. And if somebody's interested, then talk a little bit more about it. I also suggest that if you're going to do that, do it in an environment where you're not likely to be hearing the sounds. It's really hard to have that conversation while you're triggered. But if you can go for a walk or be in nature or have some other nice music playing or something like that, that's the sort of time to talk about it, because it's much easier to talk about it in a sort of careful and conscious way if you're not in distress, basically.
Oh, that's really good advice. And just, yeah, I don't think you sold your book enough. Definitely go read it.
The book is also amazing. Please buy my book. I am genuinely proud of it. I've lived in England for far too long now. I've lost my Australian confidence. I'm just like, oh, if you want to, you can. Just only if you want to. But actually, I'm genuinely proud of what I've created, and it is the book that I wish that I'd had when I was younger. Like, it's everything that I wish I could have heard and read and seen and tried when I was younger. So yeah, there will be people who won't like it. I'm going to stop doing that. Some people might not like it, that's fine. But most people will. So go buy it, please.
Exactly. Jane, thank you so much. It's just been such a great conversation. I could talk about this all day. Love hearing everything you're doing. And yeah, if anyone out there is affected, definitely check out your website and the book. It is a massive help. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you so much for having me on, and thank you for being interested in it and talking about it in a way that new people will get to hear about it. I think that's one of the best things, is that so few people know about it, that every time you talk about it, someone new learns about it, either for themselves or for somebody they care about. They're like, oh, that's what that is, and things start to fall into place. So you've done a good thing by talking about it today. Thank you.